Welcome back to another episode of the Heart to Heart podcast. And today, my guest is Rami Batal. I'm really excited to chat with Rami today for a lot of different reasons. I know a lot of people are listening to this podcast because they're interested in psychedelic medicines. And, Rami is a wealth of knowledge in that area. He's the CEO of Universal Ibogaine. So we're going to be talking a lot about Ibogaine today. But Rami has a huge and extensive background in the pharmaceutical industry. He's also a pharmacist. He has a PhD from McGill in experimental medicine. He's also an MBA. So welcome to the show, Rami. And can you just tell us a little bit about yourself before we start chatting about Ibogaine?
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me here, Mike. And it's a pleasure to be with you and with your audience. It's My background is as you have described. I come primarily from the biopharmaceutical industry, cut my teeth working in the US, for starters, out of New York with what we call the Cure Corridor, which is this area that spans New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where the big pharmaceutical industries have set shop. I've worked also in Europe by extension, and I've come back to Canada also, continue to do the good work that I hope I was doing. My focus has been, for the most part, on what we call neuropsychiatry or nervous system disorders or mental health and behavioral health. It's a passion, it's a thrust of my career. Psychedelics for me are an extension of this particular domain or discipline because they are powerful, potent agents that can do a lot of good if they're done right and responsibly in that area. And I've touched, like you did, Mike, on cannabis at some point in time, founded a company that focused on making cannabinoids, actual pharmaceuticals for proper use in proper meds and proper indications. And I built that company and sold it. And I think psychedelics are the excitement of the future. And I'd like to be part of that. And thank you again for welcoming me.
Oh, well, thanks so much again for coming on, and we certainly do appreciate that, and thanks so much for telling us a little more about yourself and where you're coming from. And yeah, so how did you get started with Universal Ibogaine? How did that come about, Rami?
Excellent. In my last tenure, I have worked very closely in the context of biotech, but it was biotech that was a bit outside my core passion and area of expertise. I've worked in osteoarthritis. I've developed a drug, helped develop a drug for osteoarthritis, which is sort of a huge improvement of the classical NSAIDs that we use. NSAIDs are things like Motrin IB and Advil and what have you. It's a platform that protects against any issues to do with ulcers and what have you, which is of course a big problem with these medicines. This is a drug that has got into phase 3, which is in our world the most advanced stage of clinical experimentation before it becomes available to all. It was exciting. We've done deals globally because the product was liked, etc. But it was a bit outside what I really like to do, which is this focus on the brain, the custodian of the human soul, the ability to modulate the brain. I got a call because Universal Ibogaine was moving to the next level. Universal Ibogaine cares about doing things right through experimentation under the sanction or the blessing of regulatory authorities. They called on me. We have a big plan also for clinics, addiction management clinics. Of course, the big problem that we all know. They fell on their heads and they thought maybe I'm the guy for the job. So they called me and I saw the fit immediately. And the rest is hopefully the future, not the history.
Excellent. Yeah. And, it's a lot of people, when they talk of psychedelics, they sort of talk about LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, sort of like the classic psychedelics. I also prescribe ketamine, which you and I have chatted about before. Now, ketamine is not a psychedelic, it's actually an anesthetic, but it just gives people a little bit of a dissociative effect that some people sort of describe as a psychedelic like experience. And it certainly has, profound effects on mental health, particularly for PTSD, depression, anxiety. But ibogaine is a lot different than these other medicines that I'm talking about, and particularly because the half life is so long. So, why would you say that ibogaine may in fact be I'm not don't not necessarily better than some of the other medicines, but when would it be, more indicated for someone to take ibogaine as opposed to, say, someone who wants to take psilocybin or MDMA? And when I say psilocybin, I'm referring to magic mushrooms. So I just want people to know that, because it's certainly not a mainstream word that we use yet. So psilocybin is magic mushrooms. But if you can go ahead, Rami, and let us know why someone may choose ibogaine over another psychedelic. I think we'd all appreciate that.
Excellent question, Mike. Let me first of all start by commending you for being ahead of the curve in terms of the adoption of psychedelics in a clinical setting. And I can mention with confidence that in the use or utilization of ketamine, you were even ahead of a small company we call Johnson and Johnson globally that has managed ultimately to develop a version of ketamine called S-ketamine that is now indicated for resistant depression. So these medicines clearly, even in the hands of the most conservative of companies, are effective. They do the job so long as they can be managed safely. So here in comes Ibogaine. Ibogaine, as our executive chairman Shane likes to call it, is the granddaddy of psychedelics. It's a very potent agent. It is not necessarily one that is associated with tripping the way we classically understand it. If anything, the tripping that comes as a byproduct of the utilization of ibogaine is not necessarily enjoyable. It's not the kind of experience that you want to go through unless you have a particular malaise or a disorder that you want to tackle. And the one that is most susceptible to ibogaine is actually addiction. It's described as an addiction disruptor. I've heard that term so many times. I mean, if you're looking for a definition of something transformational, you look for something that is called an addiction disruptor. So let me try to translate this into English. When we currently conventionally try to manage addiction, in particular opioid addiction, we introduce what they call substitution therapy. So the idea is to reduce the harm by allowing patients that have been plagued by this particular disorder to get off illicit medicines that are less regulated, that we don't know exactly what's inside them. That's how synthetic fentanyl came to our environment. It was laced or spiking something else. So we're going to try to get them off those and into a more medical setting. We introduce classically opioids. That's how we treat the addiction of opioids, by substituting one good source for opioids for another, which is the illicit source. But that, at the end of the day, is continuing within the family of opioids, which are very potent. They have a place in therapy, but they are obviously dangerous from a dependency standpoint. We're not really ultimately solving the problem. We're reducing the harm. We're on our way to solving the problem, but not solving the problem. Ibogaine works in a very different way. Coming from the psychedelic family, it has a plethora of effects that would have on the brain. I'm not going to bore you with these details, but I'm just going to convey to your audience that it is one of those that I was trained 20, 25 years to respect as an agent. It's what we call a broad spectrum. I'll use a term, but it's not meant to be dirty drug or a promiscuous drug, in the sense that it doesn't go and hit something specific. It's working on many receptors, many circuits in the brain at the same time. It's doing many good things at the same time. And in doing so, empirically, by empirically, I mean just by observation, people noticed over the years that it breaks the cycle of addiction in a very powerful way. Patients that are treated acutely, by acutely, I mean over a couple of days or a few days with ibogaine, find themselves not necessarily having the curve. They do not necessarily suffer as much from the withdrawal. Their situation is much better controlled, and they kind of go on to live their own lives. And for me, for someone that comes from the conservative pharmaceutical environment, this is like magic. It's something that is transformational and very powerful. It is not a drug, though, that you take home and obtain. I don't in my life think that I'm going to see it on over the counter in the pharmacies in which I practice. It will never be one of those, because the trip, quote unquote, that the patient goes through over 2 3 days as we are administering ibogaine is a potent one, and there are issues in regard to the safety profile of the drug. It can impact the heart in a very strong way for certain patients. So we need monitoring. We need a professional to be standing next to the patient, looking at their heart, looking at their situation as they go through this quote unquote trip. They emerge on the other side healed, saved. And of course, there's going to be a lot of post care that comes with that, but it has to be done in a very professional setting.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's a really good answer. And I really appreciate that. And there's a couple things that I wanted to touch on there. Like, I really like how you described it as something that's the granddaddy of all the psychedelics, and also that it's an addiction disruptor. And we hear all the time about like opioid addiction, but people obviously are addicted to other things. So you feel that it can be do you feel that it can be just as effective, say, for things like alcohol or for other substances like a tobacco? I've heard people, getting eliminating the use of tobacco with ibogaine. So I know you spoke a little bit about the opiates, but I really like how you described it as an addiction disruptor. So do you feel like its indications are far beyond opiates?
Indeed, you've certainly done your research, Mike. The starting point is opioids because it's the near and present danger. And it's been proven over time, and I say proven in terms of observations, in clinical practice, in jurisdictions where it's allowed to be very effective in terms of opioids. But there is evidence, and you'll hear me say that like a broken record, because there is evidence, but we need to substantiate that evidence. But there's a strong body of evidence that it can work for other addictions, as you had highlighted. And this is the beauty of it, beauty. This is the potency of it, or the impact that it could have. If you're treating opioid addiction conventionally, the way we do it with opioids, well, you're treating it narrowly. You're focused on opioid addiction. When you talk about something that resets the brain a la psychedelic, or rewires the brain a la psychedelic, i.e., ibogaine, then you open a lot of other domains. And yes, there is evidence in terms of, let me start with the most addictive after opioids, nicotine. So you talked about tobacco. So if you're looking up in the hierarchy of addiction or dependency, opioids are on top. Then comes nicotine, which people underestimate, but it's quite the hook. It's not easy to get off nicotine. So it hits nicotine, according to some evidence. And then it hits alcohol. There is evidence to that effect, but it also works on the category of medicines where we do not necessarily have an answer in terms of addiction, which is cocaine and the other stimulants, whether it's methamphetamines or crystal meth or what have you. This category seems also to be susceptible to ibogaine, always done responsibly in the right setting. But we still need to establish more evidence in this regard.
That's excellent. And this is just my personal opinion on this, and maybe you have your own, but I feel that when someone is addicted to anything, doesn't necessarily matter whether it's nicotine or whether it's alcohol. Basically, what they're looking for is a change in their consciousness. Like, they don't like the way that they feel right now. They're not at peace with how they feel right now. So they're looking for a substance to change the way that they feel. So if as you said, like, ibogaine is an addiction disruptor. If you disrupt that sort of mindset or that connection in the brain that people are having, then to me it makes sense that it would apply literally to everything. Because in one sense, certainly, there's going to be specific addictions, like to opiates over, say, something like nicotine, and they hit different receptors. But at a very deep level, at the root of the problem, the person who's addicted to something, they still are someone who's basically not at peace with where they are in the present moment or where they are in their life. And because of that, they're grabbing or searching for a substance to change the way that they feel. With ibogaine, it seems like when you disrupt that circuit that's going on in the brain that tells someone that they're addicted to nicotine or whether they're addicted to opiates, that gets disrupted. And because that gets disrupted, it seems like it would be, effective, and as you've said and alluded to earlier, that is, effective for things far more beyond opiates. And because of that, I think it could be, literally effective for more or less, any addiction. Is that something that you have an opinion on, Remy?
Well said, Mike. If this influencer thing doesn't work for you, come over and join us at Universal Ibogaine.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Good to have a backup plan always.
Well said. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so in addition to you chatted a little bit. I just wanted to ask you this because I know that a lot of the listeners are kind of very curious about specific receptors, and the classic receptor that the psychedelics, that the classical psychedelics, LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin I'm referring to. They mostly act on 5-HT2A, but it seems like the ibogaine extends beyond that. Is that something that, and certainly you don't have to go into a level of detail that a PhD pharmacologist would only understand, but if you could maybe just speak a little bit about the different receptors and how ibogaine may in fact be more disruptive because it's hitting on more than one receptor, more than just a 5-HT2A.
Perfect. Well, thank you for, first of all, for getting me off the hook, because I'm still in the learning process of what those receptors are. I just know that it's very broad in its impact in terms of serotonin. I assume also, like any other addiction medicine, it would be working on the dopamine receptors, which is the reward cycle or circuit. Um, there is also another dimension to it. It seems to be able to stimulate the production of something we call the neurotrophic factor, which is
Okay.
a factor that builds up brain circuits. So it is indeed rewiring the brain because it's allowing for the growth of neurons through that factor in places where they were not before. It's breaking circuits, it's rebuilding circuits. So you can imagine it's as if you have some sort of a master key, a master break to the circuit that you are reintroducing into the system. I come back to where I started a few questions ago and say, what I learned 20, 25 years ago in the area of nervous system disorders when I was in the pharma industry is that the best of medicines that we have for the brain are ones that are, I call them dirty drugs or broad spectrum or promiscuous. They hit on many things at the same time. If you start very much focusing on one particular receptor, odds are you're either getting away with a narrow indication, very narrow, or nothing at all. You fail. This is the way the system works. It's complex, and it requires us to be as complex and as promiscuous in addressing it. And ibogaine is one of those babies.
Nice. Well, I think all of our listeners would definitely appreciate that, and I think that one thing that I wanted to ask about, because I know that I've had some people comment on recently, and there's been some research on this indicating that psilocybin can lead to the reduction in the shortening of telomeres. So for everyone listening to this, more or less the best indication we have for looking at how we age and how to age well is looking at the length of our telomeres. So the longer our telomeres are, generally the better we age. But there's also been some indication that the shortening of telomeres is linked to poor mental health.
Mm.
So I'm very interested, and I'm not sure if this is even, there's been any research done on this, but have you looked at ibogaine into how it's influencing telomere receptors, and if it does have any influence on aging? And I don't necessarily just mean in how you appear, aesthetically, but on the brain and on things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease and cognitive disorders. Like, do you see ibogaine potentially as something that could prevent or potentially even treat early onset dementia or Alzheimer's?
Perfect. Great question. So I'm still, Mike, a student of ibogaine. I'm learning about it. I'm learning about its breadth. I'm just going to put out a couple of observations for the audience here, and then I'm going to go back and tackle one in particular, which is cognition, or specifically, I'm going to tackle Parkinson's with you in the context of ibogaine. The two observations are there's a plenty of evidence out there in regard to psychedelics, psilocybin being here an example, but it is an evidence that we are refining, calibrating, building up now that the research doors are open. We're going to get to a point whereby we can separate a bit more the wheat from the chaff, and we're not there yet. So there are a lot of claims in regard to being utilized for this or that, or showing this or that, and we as the audience here need to be critical in regard to looking at them and making sure that we look at it dispassionately, the way I try to look at all the medicines that were in my pharmacy shelf. I'm dispassionate about them. I understand that each of them does something very specific better than others. They're going to be for the right patient or the right consumer at the right time, dosed in the right way, and administered in a certain way. So what I'm trying to do is that when you see a broad application of a particular agent, be it psilocybin or other, be first of all skeptical and say to yourself, okay, it must work for something better than it does for other. And let's target it that way, and let's look for the other agent that would do exactly what we want it to do. The other observation here for everybody is that we do a lot of what we call in our heads translation. There are a lot of studies out there that have been done in rats and mice and rabbits and pigs and what have you. And we extrapolate, we say to ourselves, if it's shown what it's shown in these animal models, then that'll make sense for us as humans. And this is not exactly the, the case all the time, especially when we're talking about the nervous system. We have a very special brain. It's much more developed than the brains of other mammals or other animal models. And we have to take into consideration that what works for them does not work for us. All to say, when you see these bodies of evidence, look at them very critically, try to speak with the experts, ask Mike, ask the experts. Mike is capable here to do his research and he can address them. Be discriminatory in the way you look at evidence. But let me go back to cognition, or Parkinson's in particular, as an extension of cognition. I mentioned a few moments ago that ibogaine has had that impact on the neurotrophic factor. It's specifically what they call glial derived, glial is a kind of cells, glial derived neurotrophic factor. Now we know that this particular factor has shown incredible effects in Parkinson's. I've seen dramatic changes in people, like the movie Awakening, or Awake, if I'm remembering correctly. Robin Williams, another mental health victim, of course, was in that movie. So the neurotrophic factor can get people running, focused, that have severe Parkinson's. And there was actually a company out of Canada some 10 years ago, run by Dr. Eric Moore, called MedGenesis, that was trying to put this factor, neurotrophic factor, in the brains of people. They were trying to drill holes in the brains of people and get it to a part of the brain called the putamen, so that they can get that dramatic effect in terms of Parkinson's. All to say that if we are to establish that ibogaine actually stimulates the production of the neurotrophic factor, you would think to yourself, oh, it makes sense for me to link it to Parkinson's. And there is some evidence out there that does something really nicely for Parkinson's and by extension cognition, but we're going to build the evidence in that direction when the time comes.
Okay, excellent. And then I'll just take a little bit of a shift in the conversation and just kind of get back to Universal Ibogaine specifically. So, how long has Universal Ibogaine been running as an operation?
Perfect. So Universal Ibogaine is coming on its third anniversary pretty soon. At some point in time, hopefully over the coming year, we're planning on spreading out the wealth in terms of our shareholder ownership. So we're considering seriously a public offering to be able to build on the success that we have created. In the organization, we are very much focused on advocacy and education as a thrust. There's also the thrust of developing the Ibogaine platform as medicines of the future, as part of the psychedelics family, starting with addiction. And the third thrust is going to be, we want to be part of the healthcare delivery solution of addiction. So we're going to be operating infrastructure to allow us to put the best kind of innovation in the treatment of patients or with the addiction disorder, taking into consideration the importance of including the complexity of pre-care, through care, and then post-care. So 3 years in the making, we've made some strides. There's still a lot of work ahead of us, and we're out there to expand our shareholder base pretty soon.
Fantastic. And how many clinics do you have right now, roughly?
So we've done our first transaction in terms of the first clinic that we have acquired, and we have plans to go very aggressively very soon.
Okay. Okay. And how many people do you feel like you'll be able to treat in the future using Ibogaine?
Um, the introduction of Ibogaine in the US and Canada will have to follow, of course, the regimented trials that someone like Health Canada or the US FDA would require. There's an idea, and because we do have a history and legacy and association with Ibogaine treatment clinics in jurisdictions that authorize it or allow it. Example would be Mexico. So we have the Clear Sky brand that is operating in Mexico. So far, our board director, Dr. Alberto Sola, has treated thousands of patients effectively with Ibogaine and saved them from their addiction. So we could potentially, depending on this kind of legality of it, continue to expand that footprint in jurisdictions that would allow the use of Ibogaine. Our focus for the US and Canada in the near future is on optimizing addiction management with the tools that are available to us until such time that we introduce Ibogaine as part of the mix.
Okay, excellent. And just coming back to the thousands of people that have been treated at the clinic in Mexico, we've chatted largely or basically solely just about addiction today. But do you feel like there's enough evidence for Ibogaine for treating just mental health disorders without addiction? So I see a lot of patients who have PTSD, they have depression, and I absolutely, most of these patients do have substance abuse disorders along with their diagnosis of PTSD or depression. But are you seeing people who do not have any addiction disorders and they're solely coming to the office to get Ibogaine just for say treatment resistant depression or just for PTSD or just for generalized anxiety?
Perfect. Great questions. Great questions. So I'll start with this. I'll start by putting out the manifesto, and I think you agree with me, Mike, that the addiction set of disorders or conditions are part and parcel of a larger set of mental health and behavioral health issues or illnesses. These two are interconnected. It's one integral set of conditions and illnesses because they impact the brain and how it's modulated. So I completely agree with you that if you are to start with a particular therapeutic modality like Ibogaine that has proven to be effective in addiction, that you start getting excited about other things that you can certainly do. I would say that when it comes to Ibogaine, I have seen enough evidence to get me excited. It's like breadcrumbs for me in regard to pursuing other indications. But the conservative pharma man in me wants to see that evidence built up, regimented in what we call controlled settings, so that I become even more of a believer. And at the end of the day, I want to remind everybody that this is the kind of therapy that will be assisted. It'll be in a particular setting, and it's meant to serve more an acute setting than it is chronic setting. When we talk about anxiety or some of the other good indications, that important indications that you have highlighted, those require more of a chronic follow-up, more longer term. But what we can do is that we can start thinking, getting excited about Ibogaine as a resetter of the system, whereby we break particular circuits, we restart a particular process, and then we follow through either with other pharmacology or other treatment and management modalities to make sure that those wonderful patients are saved and they are here with us, fully productive, fully capable, and living a happy life that they deserve to live.
Perfect. And in addition to treating the patients for addiction and for other disorders, I'm just kind of wondering what is roughly the success rate of someone, like say if you're addicted to opiates and you go to an Ibogaine clinic, what should they, it's actually, let me kind of rephrase that. If someone is to come to you for an Ibogaine session, say at Clear Skies in Mexico, could you just walk us through what that would look like? And before you answer that, could you also tell us what is roughly, I don't know if you have a percentage, the success rate of someone who's abusing opiates and then starting Ibogaine? Like, how likely are they to kick their habit? And then after that, if you could go back and answer again, what it kind of looks like, just to walk through an Ibogaine session.
Excellent questions. I wish you had prepared me for all this so I can get my numbers right. But I'll I'll
Well,
do
I'm sure people are going to enjoy this and going to want to have you back on. So so
Thank
don't
you.
don't worry about that.
Thank you for that, Mike. So let me start by listen, the numbers have been handed to me roughly. I'm still going to scrub them because I care a lot about my numbers and I want them to be out there and credible. But let me start by this. I believe that what I heard is that if you are to go through a conventional opioid treatment, so what we call the substitution treatment, using the existing agents that we have, so Suboxone or what have you, that you're looking at an effectiveness rate long term, perhaps, I was told, to check 10, 20%. So out of 5 patients, you get one helped and they become sober, maybe a little bit more. I was told the numbers that are coming out of Clear Sky, and again, I need to scrub these numbers, are suggesting that we can go up to 50 or 70%. So we're talking about a five-fold improvement in terms of outcome. And this is without being able, because remember how it operates in Mexico. It's a pure acute setting. Ladies and gents, when I say acute, I mean that you are in a setting for a short period of time, and then you go back to where you've come from. But in reality, we have a huge aspiration to be able to follow through with patients in what they call the post care. I truly believe that mental health generally, addiction included, are dynamic diseases. You dip and you go out, and then you dip again, and it all depends on the day and the conditions and the environment. So the ability to continue to be connected to the patient in a way that is professional, that maintains their privacy and confidentiality, would give us even an additional thrust in terms of how successful that therapy would be. So I'd like to think about the 70% and go north from there, as opposed to anything else, if we are to do this right in an optimal setting. As for what we do currently, going back to your second part of the question, in Mexico, in Cancun, again, describing it peripherally, because Dr. Sulai is going to be the authority and I'll learn my way as I go. But there is a period whereby you need to get off. If you're on substitution therapy, let's assume that you've been identified as an addiction patient and you have been treated with the conventional therapies that we have, whether it's Suboxone or what have you. We need some kind of a clearance area to get Suboxone or the other agents. Some people are still using methadone as an example for a while because these medicines tend to have a long half-life. What I mean, ladies and gents, by long half-life, they stay in your blood for a long time. When you administer them, they're not just kind of leaving your system, they stay. So we want to make sure these are out of your system because we don't want to double up. We don't want to disrupt or complicate the treatment modality. But of course, if we're to take them off something like Suboxone, after a while, they'll get the withdrawal that you'd expect to see, the crave. So we actually, believe it or not, in that pre-treatment, put them on a classical opioid like morphine. We put them on a morphine for a while because morphine has a shorter half-life relatively. It stays in their blood and then it leaves, but it's stabilizing them. It's cleaning them up. We know exactly what they're on. We know that they're not on other things that they shouldn't be on. We do what we call a pre-care for a bit. And then the treatment with Ibogaine itself is over 72 hours. It implicates, as I mentioned, close monitoring. Those patients are, first of all, screened to make sure that their heart is okay, because we mentioned that Ibogaine in its current form is going to be a bit rough on the heart. So we want to be around them. They have to be the right people. We put them into this system and we are monitoring them. We are giving them Ibogaine day 1, day 2, day 3. Then that's it. They recover over a period of time and then they go home. That's the acute therapy the way we know it right now.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, I was going to ask you a couple questions about that. So, not all the time, certainly, but by any means, but many times when people, take the classical psychedelics in the studies anyway, it's been, one dose for a psychotherapy session, and then, there's another dose, or perhaps it's the same dose given, 2 or 3 weeks later for another psychotherapy session. But in this case, it's all done sort of like back to back, and it's all done within just a few days. So it's not over weeks to months. So in a 72-hour period, so 3 days, how many doses of ibogaine are given, and when they're given, like, is there, a more of a strong effect initially on until it wears off? Like, are people sleeping much during this time? Are they eating much? Like, how does one really feel over this 72-hour period? If you could sort of just get a little bit more detailed about that.
Perfect. So I'll get back to you, Mike, on the exact SIG in terms of dosing on a daily basis, administration, because I want to always be credible in terms of what I share. I understood that there are several doses. We're not talking about 10 doses. We're not talking about one either. And they're administered over a few days. Now, this is not a patient that is sitting in their chair, comfortably eating and watching TV. We are talking here about a trip. I mean, the connection to the psychedelics. This is a trip. People describe it as a serious trip. It's not necessarily what you describe as a pleasant trip. It's a
Okay.
serious trip they go through. It varies depending on the patient, depending also on their exposure to ibogaine in the past. Because I should also mention that although the setting here is acute, in and out, some people come back for a booster in a few months' time. And sometimes it takes people 2, 3, 4 times over a long period of time to be able to completely break the habit. It
Right.
varies. And that's a sort of an observational setting. Once we move into clinical studies and we sort of tune that in, we will be able to provide you with specific information about what this particular journey looks like in terms of the initial and in terms of the boosters down the road. But for now, this is the intent. So during that trip, it depends on the patient. It depends on what they were on in the past. It depends on their previous environment. Some of them find that hard. Some of them find it harder on the second time. Some of them find it relatively straightforward. But the converging outcome at the end of the day is that, and this is the striking observation that has been passed on to me time and again, is that these craves that we expect to happen, the withdrawal that happens, the appetite to go back on the opioid is considerably diminished the moment they get out of that trip. And I cannot overemphasize how dramatic that is in the world of mental health and pharmaceuticals. The contrast, and Mike knows that very, very well, ladies and gents, the contrast, if we were to put you on an antidepressant, a classical serotonin receptor uptake inhibitor, Prozac being the flagship historically, we will not find out if this is working for you or not, except in a couple of weeks. And even when we find out if it's working for you in a couple of weeks, we still need to extend therapy to see the actual efficacy and whether or not we need to adjust the dose. Here, you're talking about a dramatic change in the state of mind of that patient on day 4, which is incredible in
Yeah.
my.
Yeah, I believe so too, and I believe it's absolutely necessary given the fact that we've basically, I think Prozac, the drug you mentioned, was first out in 1981, so that's 30 years ago, and I think we need to make a little bit of a shift in what we're doing, or 40 years ago. So I think we need to make a shift in what we're doing, because we've been treating the same thing, this, and also too, we're treating PTSD, depression, anxiety, everything basically first line has been SSRIs for decades. So I think introducing something new is absolutely needed, and it's absolutely necessary, and that's the advancement of medicine, and that's what science is supposed to do. We're not supposed to do the same thing over and over. I mean, I'm talking to someone who has a PhD in experimental medicine, but like once drugs, seem to become, you know, inefficacious in some ways over time, where we feel that we could upgrade the drugs, then we should do that. That's what science is for, and I think that psychedelics and ibogaine, being the granddaddy of psychedelics, is definitely going to help out in the future. And just specifically to, I know that there's probably still some people who are wondering, okay, so if I go to a clinic for 3 days, like, how many hours roughly am I going to be, tripping during these 3 days? Like, is it going to be like, 10 of the 72 hours? Is it going to be, 30 of the 72 hours? And again, I know you want to get your numbers, very straight, Rami. So, give us a range if that's okay. And I know that, different patients probably trip for different amounts of time, but I just feel that there's probably some people listening who are thinking, okay, if I do mushrooms or, MDMA, it's, 2 or 3 hours where it's pretty intense, but after that it kind of subsides. Something like DMT, as we know, is like 5 or 10 minutes. So, and I feel that some people may feel that this is less appealing in some ways just because of the length of it. But like, how many hours roughly, I hate to put you on the spot, but how many hours roughly out of the 72 do you think that people are going to be, quite disoriented?
Perfect. So the intensity of that monitoring is on purpose because of the variation in the length of that trip. It's certainly not going to be minutes, and it's not going to be 2 to 3 hours. The intent is to keep them monitored very, very closely because some of those trips will be prolonged. This is very complex pharmacokinetics. By pharmacokinetics, folks, I mean the way it gets to blood, how long it stays, how quickly it gets to the brain, how long it stays in the brain. It's very complex. It will vary, but it's that period of monitoring for 72 hours, empirically, experimentally, has been shown to be important because of the nature of that trip. I don't want to create the impression that you're going to Mexico, if we are allowed even to talk about this once we get to that, to stay for 3 days. Don't forget that we have to go there a little bit earlier to do that pre-care that we talked about in terms of cleaning up the system. And then after those 3 days, we want to just kind of sit down with you and make sure everything is okay for a while before you head back to where you've come from. So you have to account for that. I think it's more like a couple of weeks, 1 to 2 weeks of call it journey. I'm not going to use the word trip just to kind of expand to expand the period of time. But I mean, you know what? If that's what it takes to break potent addictions like opioids or nicotine, bring it on. And if we're
Yeah.
successful ultimately with Health Canada and the US FDA, we're going to make it easier, closer to home, and we'll be able to manage this very, very effectively.
Yeah, I mean, that's I think you hit the nail on the head there, because that's what I say to a lot of, my patients when they're afraid, say, to try a new medicine, even if it's just something like cannabis, even if it's just CBD from cannabis, which,
Mhm.
as we know, is doesn't make you high.
Mhm.
Is that, you should, if you're addicted to something, or if are really suffering mentally, you should be more afraid of staying in that mental state, or more afraid of being addicted to what you're addicted to, than to potentially trying a new medicine that's going to break that addiction. Like, of course, when you do anything that's outside of your comfort zone, it's going to feel uncomfortable. But you should feel more uncomfortable about continuing to feel the way that you feel if you're feeling poorly, or you should feel more uncomfortable about being addicted to something if you are addicted to something. So I that's the way that I try to frame it to people. So 3 days, 72 hours is not very long compared to years and years of your life being addicted to a medicine. That being said, I also want just to touch on this briefly. I know we only have about 10 minutes or so left. Was that, for most addictions, I mean, it's kind of silly to think, and I think some people on the internet have put out this incredible expectation that, if you do not any psychedelic, but certain psychedelics in certain doses one time, then everything after that in your life is just going to be like bliss, and that everything after that, if you're addicted to something, it's just going to be done forever. And I think that those expectations are too high, and we need to give people a little more of a of a grounding approach to it. And when you said earlier that some people need to come back to the clinic 2 or 3 times, I think that that's important for people to know. And obviously, and you can speak to this a little bit more, Rami, but I imagine if you're smoking 5 cigarettes a day, that's a lot different than if you're smoking 20 cigarettes a day, or if you're smoking 40 cigarettes a day. So, the person who's smoking, 2 packs a day, 40 cigarettes or so, they're probably going to need 4 sessions or more. Whereas, someone who maybe is only addicted to, 5 cigarettes a day, they may only need, one session. Has that sort of been the consensus as to what you found, that the worse the addiction, the more treatments that they'll need over time?
This rings true, Mike. It rings true, and we will find out more as we commit these studies to controlled settings. But this absolutely rings true. It's um, it's a dynamic system. This nervous system of ours. It's very complex, very evolved, and very important. Of course, going back to something that you commented on, it's the fight of your life, you folks. It's as important as you fighting cancer to save your life. At least with cancer, not to kind of compare hardships, but there's a terminal point to it. Whereas when you are with mental health, with addiction, it's a chronic situation. You're going to be in it for a long, long time. You got to fight it. You got to fight it seriously. And the system is so evolved and dynamic. Do not give up on that nervous system. Do not give up on the brain. Give it what it requires in terms of treatments and healing, and it'll help you because it is very plastic. By plastic, I mean it configures and reconfigures. These are circuits that can be broken and rebuilt. And all you need to do is give them the right tools and the right attention to get you from what you're in, because you will need that brain to be happy, to be successful, to be productive. And yes, it all depends on how you started, how far you have gone. The seriousness of the treatment will depend on where you've been in terms of either whether it's your addiction or in terms of your mental health as a whole. But treat it seriously because it's important. I've not seen a certain therapy area, treatment area, or indication area that has impacted us as a society and continues to do so more than mental health and more than addiction. And we need to fight very seriously for that to get us to be where we need to be, all of us.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I liked your point there too about, that about the brain being, malleable, and people, often don't believe that, they get into a mindset where they think that, they're just born this way, it's always going to be this way. And that's what Ibogaine can do, is that it can kind of disrupt that mindset and disrupt those sort of connections that people are making. And obviously, people who are addicted to something, or who are depressed, at one point in their life, they weren't depressed, they weren't addicted to something, and then something happened where their brain changed. So, you've already kind of accepted in some ways that, our brain has changed, and that it's changed, unfortunately, for the worse, whether it's, an addiction to a certain substance, or whether, it's poor mental health. So if you believe that, the brain can change for the worse through addiction or through mental health, then, you should in turn also believe that you can reverse that, and that you can change your brain for the better, so that your mental health can improve, and that so you can get off, these different substances that you're addicted to.
Well said.
Um,
Well said.
but that being said, Rami, unfortunately, we are kind of running at a time here now, and it's been a pleasure to chat with you today. But can you just tell us where people can find you online, and where they can find your work, and we'll kind of go from there.
That's perfect. Well, thank you, first of all, for the opportunity, Mike. It's been enjoyable, such quite the intellectual exchange, and I hope that everybody benefited from your notes and your excellent questions. We are out there. Our website is our window, universalibogaine.com. We are starting to communicate on our success as we get closer and closer to this spreading of wealth. So you're going to see bits and pieces of our communication out there. I think different media, YouTube, and what have you. But the website will be your window to the Universal Ibogaine world.
Excellent. Well, Rami, thank you so much again for coming on the show. I really do appreciate that. I'm sure we'll be, in touch offline about Ibogaine, and I'm sure I'll have a lot of listeners that will say that they want you back on the show, and that they want me to ask you some different questions about it. So, congratulations again on all your success with Ibogaine, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Rami.